Final Fantasy VII Remake is probably one of the worst games ever made. I mean, look at it. It's legit nothing like the original. Instead of fighting Sephiroth, you're trying to figure out the mystery behind a creature known as Bug Snacks. I have no idea what they were thinking. Like, what in the hell is a Grumpus?
He's having a hard time, and his wife isn't around much these days.
Final Fantasy VII Remake is the remake of the classic 1997 original Final Fantasy VII, one of the most groundbreaking and treasured RPGs of all time, arguably, of course. It only incorporates one part of the story, the opening hours of the original, but it expands upon it and gives the events more depth and detail and meaning. Given the announcement of a PS5 upgrade and a new DLC episode, I figured it was as good a time as any to tell you that this game is worth your time and money. I hope to convince you of that throughout this video. If I don't, well, maybe I'll at least find my dumb jokes funny enough to stick around for. I hope. Before I begin, let me just say that the fact that this game was free on PlayStation Plus is awesome. They were of course kind enough to make sure that the free PS5 upgrade is not honored with the PS Plus version when it comes out. I mean, look. Who really wants to play a better version of a game when the lesser version is still there? I know I do. I hate improvements across the board. Even the DLC episode is exclusive to PS5 because, of course, when your new hardware is notoriously limited and hard to find and to get, the number one thing you want to do is make sure that one of your biggest exclusive titles has a new console-exclusive DLC episode. It's to drive sales, of course. Right down the drain. Can you detect the salt there? Good. Then I've done my job. It's like how they sell Munchkins as if it's not just the middle of the donuts. We know what you're doing, Magic Man. Clone High reference for you intellectuals out there. I don't want to be entirely negative, as this is meant to be me convincing you to jump into this game. Not literally, obviously, because VR is not that far along yet, but someday soon, I'm sure, you're going to end up headbutting your TV, and I don't want you to do that. You might break it. How can I convince you that the time is now, or rather, the time is June, when the DLC episode and upgrade comes out to play Final Fantasy VII Remake? A few reasons. The story, the characters, the sound, and the gameplay. Have I convinced you yet? Oh, you need me to go into detail, don't you? Okay, fine. As I said, Final Fantasy VII Remake is rebuilt from the ground up as a full retelling of the original Final Fantasy VII. New assets, audio, and gameplay all built up from scratch. And of course its story remains rather faithful to the original, but expands upon it in various ways. I won't describe any specifics to avoid the spoilers, you know, those things suck, but there's much more time spent on the community of the different sectors of Midgar you travel around. You spend more time talking with the various characters and learning their histories and stories, even accepting quests and tasks to build your own renown as the Merc Cloud is known to be. The quests themselves are a little fetch questy, and some of them kind of just typical RPG flair, but I think it seeks to kind of build out the city in a way you don't really get to see in the original, and I did enjoy that quite a bit, even if the quests themselves are hit or miss. I would even say that there's definitely parts of the story where it actually calls into question the actions of our protagonists in a much more realistic and moving way. It doesn't shy away from having the player reckon with the fact that there's always a quiet, unmoving variable amidst conflict. The innocent people caught in the middle of something they know little about and have no power to get away from. Okay, I lied. I'm going to describe only one moment, which is only one in a few moments for me, just in the beginning, where I was stunned after the opening moments. I said moment a lot. Anyway, in a relatively quiet moment where you're just trying to get back to the group after you bombed the reactor and got separated, you hear people calling out for their loved ones, wondering if they're okay. It took me by surprise, and there's more of these small little moments peppered throughout that make Midgar feel more alive and fully realized. But that moment in particular stuck out to me in a big way. Another thing about the story, or through the story, is, as I mentioned, you learn more about the characters that inhabit the world, but even the supporting characters, mainly Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, are given more screen time than the original game, and we learn more about them. what drives them. And you of course end up caring more about what happens to them. And again, it's just another way that I think Final Fantasy VII Remake flexes its storytelling muscle in a way to just have such fully defined characters. I can't say more about the story because if I did, I would have to go into detail, but I will say that Final Fantasy VII, out of the Final Fantasy games I have played, has always had my favorite story, and by extension that includes Final Fantasy VII Remake. You see, at least in my view, Final Fantasy VIII is great, but its story kind of loses me about midway through, and then by the end, I'm just there for the ride. And I had the same reaction to Final Fantasy IX. I'm only about halfway through Final Fantasy X at the recording of this video, so I can't really comment on how it gets to its conclusion, but what I can say is that I like all the characters far more than I liked a lot of the ones from 8 and 9. Also, I felt like the way Squall was depicted in Final Fantasy VIII was almost a retread of Cloud from 7, where Cloud is kind of just apathetic and distant and seemingly uncaring at first. They really just wanted to hit you over the head with that with Squall. Zidane, well, he never really grew on me, but Titus I find a much more easily likable main character. The point is that I'm trying to make is I'm very biased towards the story to 7 and by extension 7 Remake. Forgetting that, I would definitely put the cast of 7 as some of my favorite, and arguably the most iconic. In the remake, they all sound and act like you expect, and even Cloud, as much of a dick as he can be, clearly can't help himself but form a bond to the others, Aerith, Tifa, Barrett, and Red 13. Again, I really can't say more without ruining it, but suffice to say, they all have a chance to shine and have realistic motivations that drive them. Also, seriously, have you seen Tifa? Damn, son. I also have some good news for you. If you like the music of the original game, Final Fantasy VII Remake brings those iconic tracks back and has some new ones of its own to add to the lineup. Now, I feel like I have to give the disclaimer with the music in games at times that I am not a composer, nor an audio expert by any means, but I just love the way the score and it consistently was successful for me at evoking the proper emotions and complementing a scene. Recently, I was listening to a podcast and one of the guys who is a composer said something about musical scores in various movies and games, and it just got me thinking about the nature of their existence, and I realized I don't know jack about them. Hence the only reason I give that disclaimer. For most people, if they like the sound, it's not gonna matter how it's made or who made it, and so that's why I say if you like the original, you'll like this one, cause that's how I felt. Of course, my two favorite tracks being the iconic prelude that goes something like you didn't need me to do that, and it probably didn't sound anything like it. Or Aerith's theme, which I won't try to do. Bum bum bum. Bum bum. Okay, I'm gonna stop. You're not convinced yet. Okay. The game looks great too. Does that help? Gone are the jagged polygons of the original. Beautifully animated cutscenes await. I can't tell you how much this game blew me away with its visual design. It's pretty consistent with the original art design while modernizing it. It's not without its imperfections, but this is a damn good looking game. And if you're like, man, I want to play it in 4K, bro, the good news is it's going to be in 4K and hit 60 FPS. The PS5 drop is going to be sweet. And I hear you, PS5s are still hard to come by. I was lucky enough to get one, so if you're still trying, you can totally just get this game on PS4, probably pretty cheap, and you would likely get the free PS5 upgrade when you do get one, and with save transfers, you can carry over your save right where you left off on your brand new shining console. I realize the combat may not be to the liking of some diehard fans, and I do understand that. Believe me, I do. There's a kind of flow to the turn-based combat of a Final Fantasy game, but I think what it does here works fairly well. The materia still works the same, and you can kind of create fun builds or even swap them out depending on the situation, and that's just awesome to me. To be fair, I'm not going to say that Final Fantasy VII Remake has the most diverse and complex character skill building and modifications you can make to your character's abilities, but it's enough it gives the RPG fans something to like while also satisfying people who aren't as into it. Because yeah, characters have their strengths by default and you can tweak them to an extent, but Final Fantasy has a, I guess, weird history in my opinion of character building. At least Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, and even 10 I would argue, it's just never been consistent. That's not to say that the systems in each game are bad, just kind of strange at times. Without having played all of them, or most of them, it's hard for me to make that statement more declarative or definitive, but yeah, I don't know. I start each game in this franchise totally confused as to how the system works, only to kind of get it at some point. And I of course have some issues here and there with Final Fantasy VII Remake combat and stuff, but that's not what we are here for. Okay, are you convinced yet? Look, I get it. I'm biased, I really like the game, and it was one of my favorites from last year, and I get that I'm probably hyping it up, maybe too much, and I set you up for failure. Sorry. I just like the game a lot and I want you to experience it as well. There are a few surprises in there, of course, for the story, so I'm not going to tell you that you're going to have a completely faithful reimagining of the original, and I can tell you some of my reservations about it too, but I think it's just an incredibly well done title overall. I look at, as a whole, I guess, like its story, characters, and presentation is just far above anything I expected. There's just something about this game and the way it plays and it handles its story that does click so much with me, and I hope it does with you too. And I think, to be honest, the way we look at remasters to remakes sometimes is just not the correct way to look at it. Wanting it to be good and faithful and work well, I totally understand and I get it, I really do. But it feels like there's just this inability to see a remake or a remaster as its own thing separate from the thing that you loved as a kid or even years ago. What I'm trying to say is, if you don't like Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's not going to ruin the legacy of Final Fantasy VII all of a sudden, and that game still exists and is out there for you to enjoy. That being said, I realize this game may not be your cup of tea or scratch that itch that you have for, or maybe you should get a doctor to look at that itch, but I understand if you want to pass on it or maybe even wait for a deep sale before you take the plunge. I totally get that. I get a lot of things, and that is one of the things that I get. Just like the original game, it's not going anywhere. Neither is the remake. So all I'm saying is, take a look at the PS5 version if you can and if you're able to. And if you're still apprehensive, maybe wait for some reviews of the DLC episode. It's a great game and I think it deserves more time and attention and even, I guess, conversation. That's why we're talking about it today. These days, there's not a lot of games out there that I readily replay because they're just so good. I think back to all my times that I spent playing Dragon Age Origins or Mass Effect or even Knights of the Old Republic, but these days I just don't do it as much anymore. But Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of them. I got the Platinum Trophy after 100 hours and 2 playthroughs, and I'm eyeing another one with this upgrade. Regardless of what you decide, I do respect your choices and decisions, and I hope I convinced you today to give this game a shot. If I didn't, well, I guess I suck, don't I? Just to be clear, none of this is to criticize the original Final Fantasy VII. I played that game and I loved it as well. When I talk about the remake expanding upon the original, I mean more that it's doing just that. It's expanding on the story in a way they just either didn't have the time for, the resources for, or they just didn't think of in 1997. I also don't think that turn-based combat needs to go away per se, but I'm generally just agnostic to its existence. I don't think it's fair to say that the remake is made for the casuals, whatever that means, or is dumbed down just because it has different combat. It's just that. It's different. I like any kind of combat as long as it feels good and works well, and it works for me here. I mean, hell, look at Knights of the Old Republic. It doesn't necessarily play as great as it did or it may have felt back in 2003 and 2004, but I still love playing it to this day, and it still has a certain feel to it that I enjoy. And of course, when I say that they did a lot of subtle world building in Midgar and made everything feel more alive, that's not a knock against the original. Again, it's just much easier to focus on a city when the whole game is based on one small part of the story. It's a matter of resources, time, and everything else. The beginning of the original up until they escape Midgar is what, like 7 to 10 hours of gameplay and story in the original? In the remake, it's expanded and it's 40 to 50 hours. And sure, I will take on that criticism that this is some sort of Final Fantasy VII Remake love fest, but again, the purpose of this video is less about my nitpicks, and I do have nitpicks, and more about the positives. There's definitely filler content and some padding in the gameplay. As I said initially, it's not perfect, but the bar of quality on display here is palatable and it's just so far beyond anything that I expected. And like I said, if you like the original and are open enough to accept some changes, you'll enjoy the remake. I also would even argue if you're a new fan, you'll like the game as well. I of course urge everyone to at least try and play the original if you can and have access to it, because it's such a great experience and was definitely what got me interested in Final Fantasy. Again, I could rant and rave about the different aspects of the different games or talk about how they age, aged, but I would argue that they still feel pretty good to play. I hope with Final Fantasy VII Remake, the PS5 upgrade, it runs even better, and like I said, it could definitely get me to play it again. As I record this video, there is a Final Fantasy sale going on Steam, so you can definitely pick up a bunch of those for a pretty low price, and I definitely recommend checking out at least a few of them if you're mainly a PC gamer. So folks, that's it. That's all I have. I'm just gonna say, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments down below. And of course, like the video if you enjoyed it, dislike it if you didn't, and subscribe to support me here if that is your wish. I wish you all a happy and healthy one. Thank you for watching, and of course, I will in fact see you next time, whether you like it or not.